I do have a dog who hopefully will be quiet, but fair warning, if she starts barking, I might need to pause for a second
No
and
problem. And I mean,
quiet.
if we need to take like a big pause or anything to take her outside, we can always cut that out if we need to. Or people might find it relatable, so maybe we'd leave it in.
I say, or you can leave it in. She's a pretty cute dog.
Okay. Maybe she'll attract some attention to our conversation. We should put her on the thumbnail.
Yeah, we should be like, this is actually an interview with Abigail Westgate.
What's the dog's name?
Abigail, Abby.
Abigail. My
Yeah.
that hits a chord with me because I'll share this quick story. Graduated college, moved in with my grandmother. I had two dogs that I brought with me. One was a husky and one was this terrier mix. And the terrier was named Abby. And Abby had an accident where she was hit by a car and she had a rear leg removed. So she only had three legs. And my grandmother is such a helper and she kind of seeks out the wounded in the world. And so she instantly had an affinity for this three-legged dog. And
Oh.
I know, and long story short, I ended up, I moved out eventually and she kept Abby. And
Oh,
I
oh
know,
my God.
it was just, and it was
It was
honestly
like love or something.
love.
Yeah.
And she had Abby for probably 7 years before Abby died. And I mean, honestly, it was the remedy to loneliness because my grandmother lives by herself, but she had this dog. So she didn't live by herself
Oh,
and just loved her so much.
oh, so it's a happy story.
Very happy.
Yeah.
Yes. It was
Oh,
sad
that's
when
so
she died, but
sweet.
it was a beautiful life. And my grandmother was kind of ready to let her go because she was ready. So it was all beautiful and peaceful.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Now,
So
My Abby has a lot to live up to now.
that's right.
I'm gonna go tell her that after this. I'm like, girl,
Tradition of Abby's.
the Abby bar is high here.
Thank you so much for tuning in to the Psychology Is podcast. I'm Nick, and I'm here today with Dr. Erin Westgate, who is a professor of psychology at the University of Florida and runs the Social Cognition and Emotion Lab at Florida, and studies boredom and interest and why some thoughts are more interesting than other thoughts and what some of the routes to out of boredom are. And so I think, my intention is to have a really interesting conversation around boredom. So thank you for joining me, Dr. Westgate.
Thank you so much for having me. And I hope we don't disappoint and have a boring conversation now with that lead in.
Right. Based on everything I've read, it was honestly surprising how captivated I was by this topic, and it's the whole name of this podcast is Psychology Is, which is based on the saying where people are, psychology is. And I like to kind of emphasize the all-pervasive nature of psychology. It's everywhere people are, and it's related to everything people experience and do. So that the topics within psychology are endless, really. And boredom is certainly one that I think I had overlooked, as a topic of interest. But it's fascinating, and it's a very common, relatable experience that we all know.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. I had the same experience. Like, I didn't go to grad school to study boredom. Like, who does, right? And then I just kind of stumbled into it and was like, oh my gosh, like this mundane experience has so many interesting, important things to tell us about what we're doing and what we're feeling and our lives. So yeah, I'm glad you also found some interest in it.
definitely. And I would recommend people to read the paper that you wrote called Why Boredom is Interesting, and published it in 2019. And it's thankfully available with no paywall for people. So if you just search it on Google Scholar, you'll find it and get full access. And yeah, it's great. I feel like you really give us a bird's eye view of the general kind of trends in research, so much of which you've contributed to the field. I mean, I looked at your CV and it's just your contributions are bountiful and valuable. And it's amazing, how much you're publishing and how productive of an academic you are. I'm really inspired.
Well, thank you. I always do that, like when you study something like boredom, there's kind of a high bar
Mm,
because like when you like, this is true in a cocktail party too. Like people flee when they're like, oh, who are you? And they're like, oh, I'm Erin Westgate. And they're like, oh, what do you do? It's like, I study boredom. They're like, okay, I have to go get a drink, or, they don't want to stick around. Academics feel the same way. Like, you tell them you study boredom and like you see their like eyes start like crawling out of like, so I think really like there's a case to be made almost before you even get to the science of being like, this is why we should care and this is why it's interesting, and it's a lot of work, but it's also a great joy to like
Mm.
dig into that, I think.
Well, then let's kind of lean into that. What would you say for why we should care? Why is this relevant to people?
So, it's funny because we're talking right now, and I actually just came back from 10 days in Roatan in the Bay Islands. I'm all vaccinated now, so it was like my first like post-COVID
Mm.
vaccinated trip. And I was diving, I was scuba diving on the reef. And this is a totally alien environment, right? Like you're like underwater, you're breathing air, but it's like on a sack on your back, basically. And like the world is totally different. And I felt bored. And I
Mm.
was like, oh my gosh,
Mm.
like how can you like I feel like a bad person for feeling bored right now. And like as a boredom researcher, I was like, well, what does this mean? What is it saying? And I think that's what actually is so interesting about boredom is that it seems like this totally mundane, almost sort of childish experience. Like, I felt bad that I felt bored. Like it said something bad about me. But I should know better, and everyone should know that like boredom is just sort of a signal, and it's a way to help calibrate us towards a richer, more meaningful, happier life. That we
Mm.
feel bored when what we're doing is too easy or too hard, so it's not an appropriate challenge. But we also feel bored when what we're doing isn't meaningful. And so, knowing this, instead of just sort of like squashing that boredom away, when I was there and diving, I'm like, well, why do I feel bored right now? It's like, is this not meaningful to me? Like, no, it was very meaningful. But I realized it was a pretty easy dive. I was kind of like not challenging myself. And so I started, playing some little games with myself. Like, how much can I like move off one fin kick? How much can I just hover in place? And it was, really a signal to me that like what you're doing right now is okay, but you need to kind of modulate it to better fit your abilities. And I'd become a better diver without realizing it, but not really raise the challenge level of what I was doing appropriately.
Mm.
And that's the beautiful thing about boredom is that it's really, it's sort of like a dashboard light or a calibration signal that says that like, hey, what you're doing, it's not quite right. We want to get you back on track, but before we do that, we kind of have to let you know that something is wrong, that something needs attention, that you need to fix. And when you think about boredom in this way, it goes from being this really childish, sort of simplistic like experience to like this really useful signal that alerts you to ways that you can live a life that, and like, or even just in the moment, even if you're doing something super mundane, like doing your taxes, like think about like, how can you think about this activity in ways that better align with your values and your goals? How can you better, in this Goldilocks style sort of way, calibrate what you're doing to your ability level? If you're learning something new, you might be doing something that's too hard, and so you feel bored, so you can make it easier and you're going to learn better. And vice versa, that like if you've really mastered something and now you feel bored because it's too easy, that's actually a good sign. I always say that boredom is a sign that we're learning in a sense.
Mm.
Because when we get better at things and things become easier, they start to feel boring because there's that mismatch.
Mm.
And that's actually positive. If you know what that is trying to tell you, that means you're doing well and it's time to sort of ratchet up the challenge level a little bit. And, and I play a lot of video games too. So it's kind of like, okay, you need to like go to the higher difficulty level on the video game. The game
Mm.
has to get harder as the player gets better. And boredom is one way that tells us that. So I was just sort of fascinated to sort of see all these like really core messages that boredom tells us about how we can engage meaningfully in what we're doing and how we can do so successfully. And if we take that signal seriously instead of just sort of feeling guilty about it, even like I did at first, or trying to sort of squash it and like make it go away by distracting myself with other things.
Mm. Yes, and a great example too. I love the way you described that. So I can relate to the way that there's almost a guilty feeling, or it feels childish. It almost has a bratty quality sometimes, like I'm bored. And
Yeah.
but thinking of it in this way as a signal indicating something. In fact, I jotted down the definition from that paper that I had mentioned, which you just articulated in slightly different ways, but I'll just read it for people listening. That boredom is an affective indicator of unsuccessful attentional engagement in value goal congruent activities. And I'll read it one more time because if some people are like me, you like to hear kind of dense ideas twice. So, boredom is an affective indicator of unsuccessful attentional engagement in value goal congruent activities. So, you've talked about the key ingredients here of attention and meaning. And you've described in very interesting ways how there's kind of variations of boredom that relate a little bit more to the attention piece or a little bit more to the meaning piece or mixed. So perhaps you can just elaborate for us on the difference between that type of those two ingredients, I guess, and what their role is in boredom.
So there's this really old idea, I'm not the first person to like suddenly start studying boredom. Like there's actually a lot of really interesting work on boredom that starts around the 1950s and 1960s, around this time when automation starts becoming a thing.
Mm,
And they have all this incredible new technology, they have planes and they have air traffic control. And then they start to realize that like they have human error because these like people, these like air traffic controllers who are supposed to be monitoring planes for safety, they get bored and they stop paying attention, and vice versa. They get bored and stop paying attention, but they also get bored because they're not paying attention.
mm,
And so you see all this research starting to come out showing that boredom is sort of about this like inability to pay attention, and that we can all sort of relate to this, I think. So I often talk about this sort of analogy for academics of imagining you're like in a boring colloquium, or for non-academics, like we've all been to school, right? We've all been in that class where you're just like, oh my goodness, like I can't pay attention because like this is so simplistic and I already know all this. And please don't make me go over English grammar for the 10,000th time. I'm in 12th grade. Like, stop it. And that's boring. And it's boring because you can't pay attention to it. There's a lot of good research to sort of support that. But one of the things that we saw when we came along and started looking at the boredom literature is that there's not just one way to have trouble paying attention, that we all are sort of familiar with that, like, oh, this is too easy, like playing Candyland for the 10,000th time with like your kids or your nephews or nieces, right? But you can also have trouble paying attention because something is too hard. It's like going back to that sort of classroom example. We've all had trouble paying attention because like we know all this material. Why are you telling it to us again? But we also, I think, have, or at least I have had that experience where you're sitting in class and you're like, I don't know what that teacher is saying, but it just sounds like marmalty, like abstract jargon nonsense. And I'm like, I don't know. I have no idea what you're talking about.
yeah.
And you just kind of zone out and you have trouble paying attention. And you can feel bored for that reason too. So there's this sort of one flavor of boredom where you're bored because you can't pay attention, either because what's going on is sort of too easy for you or because it's too hard for you. I sometimes call this sort of like the Goldilocks problem, that, you want to sort of hit that sweet spot where it's like just challenging enough that it's really like occupying your full attention. It's like, new drivers, for instance, often feel this when they drive anywhere, right? That driving occupies their full attention and maybe even more than that.
Mhm.
For those of us who've been driving for 20 years, not to like age myself, but, it doesn't occupy our full attention anymore, right? Like it starts becoming too easy and our mind starts drifting off and we start, mind wandering, and we probably feel a little bored just, driving down the street to the grocery store. And that's attentional boredom. Attentional boredom is all about this sort of Goldilocks mismatch between what you're capable of doing and what you're actually doing. And when those have a mismatch, you have trouble paying attention. And those feelings of inattention, we feel that affectively as the feeling of boredom. So that's all like fine and dandy. There's tons of evidence to support this. But there's also, in the early 2000s, folks started saying like, wait, that's all seems fine and dandy. But like, sometimes you're in class or you're in a lecture or a talk and you understand what people are saying perfectly well, right? You just don't care. It's like, maybe it's like in a different discipline. Maybe it's like, not to hurt my friends in behavioral genetics, but maybe it's a behavioral genetics talk and you're just like, oh my goodness, I'm glad you like that. I don't know why I should care about this.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
No, it's
For whatever
everyone
reason,
has their personal
yeah, we all
example,
have our,
you
we
know?
all have our
Yeah,
things,
no
right?
doubt.
But for whatever reason, whatever it is, you may understand everything that's going on. It may be completely within your capacity to pay attention, but it doesn't have any meaning to you. It's not connected to any goals you care about, or if it is, those goals don't have a lot of value. You may be, thinking about like, oh, I want to like get coffee, or I want to get a job, or I want to get like home and lie in my PJs. And what I'm doing right now isn't matching up with these sort of goals and values that I have. And when you experience that, it's sort of experienced as a lack of meaning, that there's this formal definition of meaning as involving these sort of three components: significance, coherence, and purpose. And
Hmm.
it lines up in the moment with that same thing, that it's like what you're doing, you need to care about it. It needs to feel like there's a purpose. It needs to have value or significance, as the meaning literature often calls it. And it needs to make sense to you. There needs to be that coherence where everything is sort of lining up. And it's like, yes, it makes sense that I'm doing this because it's furthering this valued goal. And the sum result of all that is this feels deeply meaningful to me. And when we don't have that, what we've found and what others have suggested is that we feel bored. And so boredom has these sort of twin causes, that on the one hand, you can feel bored because, this Goldilocks challenge problem. It's too hard or too easy. It's not optimally challenging. You can't pay attention well. But you can also feel bored because what you're doing doesn't feel meaningful to you personally in that moment. And that can also make you feel bored. And we have some initial evidence that these kinds of boredom feel different to people. So feeling bored when something's too hard or too easy is sort of that, and I feel sort of like restless, or, that sort of like, I'm having trouble paying attention, sort of fidgety, mind wandering feeling. But for instance, in the lab, when we make people bored through a lack of meaning instead, what we see is that people report sort of a different profile of sort of symptoms, that they talk instead about like wanting to do something else, that they feel like sad and like frustrated. Like they have this sort of whole like sense of like, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to do something else, versus this feeling of like, I can't quite dial in right. And I'm like getting like irritated by it.
Mm.
And one of the things we're looking at now, and that we predict that these different causes should have different consequences, that feeling bored because you can't pay attention should lead to different consequences for your behavior than feeling bored because what you're doing doesn't feel meaningful. And that's research that we're looking into right now, and really sort of, nailing down like, if there's these two different causes of boredom, does it matter for, how people ultimately go on to behave? And we think it should, but we're still looking to see whether, in fact, the empirical data support that and show that it really does.
Mm. Interesting. I'll be tracking that because that's an interesting question, right? I see the distinction between these types of boredom, and I would also imagine that it leads to different consequences. You've acknowledged in different papers that some people might think of that type of boredom where it's too hard, can't understand it, as frustration. You've acknowledged that some people would think of it like that, but you think it still falls under the umbrella of boredom. So, and then my thought that I wanted to ask you about is it possible that frustration is more related to this is too hard for me, but I actually really do care about it? This is valuable to me and I want to understand, but I'm not understanding it. That, when I examine my own experience, is kind of what's behind frustration. It's like I'm not able to do it, but it's relevant and I want to. But if I'm not able to do it, if it's too hard for me to understand and I don't care about it, that feels more of the conventional sense of boredom. So can you just talk to me about that, your how that
Yeah,
fits in?
yeah, I love that you bring that up, because I think that was one of the wilder predictions that our sort of model of boredom made. And it's really a purely theoretical prediction originally, which is there's all this work showing that people feel bored when they can't pay attention. And I actually came in undergrad from a cognitive psych background. So I knew a lot about attention. And I was like, it doesn't make any sense that if boredom cannot be about attention and also only be about understimulation, because there's two
Mm.
kinds of attentional failure. It's all this old Wiccans work on like this like balance between cognitive demands and cognitive resources. So either boredom is not about attention, it's really just about understimulation. But if it is really about attention, it has to be the case that it can be caused in either direction, theoretically, based on sort of like a priori what we know about cognitive psychology and how attention works. That said, we had very little evidence at the time to support that. And so I actually went and was like, well, this is a really testable hypothesis, which is, kind of what I love about psychology is, we can make these claims, but then we can go off and be like, okay, well, let's see if that's actually the case and whether, people in the real world behave the way we would predict they would. And so we have a couple pieces of evidence that suggest that boredom does seem to be about this kind of overstimulation as well as this kind of classic understimulation. One of them, this is correlational, but we had people do this air traffic control task and we had it be ambiguously hard. So some people thought it was really easy. Some people thought it was really hard. Some people were like, it was perfect. And what we looked at was, so if I asked you, for instance, Nick, like how hard it was for you, you might be like, oh, it's too easy for me. It's so easy. It was a breeze. And if you ask me, you'd be like, oh, that was way too hard. It was terrible. And then we'd be like, okay, great. So Nick, while you're here, can you tell me how bored you feel? And can you tell me how frustrated you feel? And, we asked me the same questions. And what we saw was that when it came to frustration, there was a very clear relationship between difficulty and frustration, that the more difficult the task was to someone, the more frustrated they felt. And that makes a lot of sense because frustration is sort of about goal obstruction. Like you said, like there's a goal you have in mind, you want to achieve it. And the more you're blocked from achieving that goal, the more frustrated you feel. So the more difficult it gets, the more frustrated you get, all across the board. Boredom is a little bit different because it's not necessarily about obstructing that goal. It's about the process. Like, am I feeling subjectively like I'm having difficulty concentrating, while I'm pursuing that goal? And so if that's the case, we'd actually expect this sort of curvilinear U-shaped relationship between boredom and difficulty, where when something's really easy, it's hard to concentrate on it because it's too easy. So it's going to be more boring. As it becomes more difficult, it should actually get less boring to a point. And then once you sort of hit that optimal challenge part, as it becomes more difficult, it should become more boring again, because you're having trouble paying attention to it. And when we looked at it, I actually almost dropped my jaw because the data were just so beautiful. Like I was like, that never happens, right? We never just run a study and it's like, here it is. Here's your perfect U shape as you predicted. And here's your perfect line. And I was like, oh my God, I was actually in grad school at the time and I ran next door to my advisor's office. And I was like, oh my God, Tim, look at these plots. And he was like, oh, is this your theoretical predictions? And I was like, no, this is the actual data.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, it was one of those for a scientist, very exciting moments where it's like, oh my God.
Frame that image and put it on your wall.
I have it all over. I had it as my desktop background for a
while.
Love it. It's beautiful. But what it suggests and what's really interesting to me and goes to your question is these were the same people, which means that if you think about it, the people that said this was too hard, they were saying they were frustrated. Absolutely. But they were also saying that they were bored. Mm-hmm. And I think this sort of goes to sort of our sort of lay theories of emotion, that we have these kind of really simplistic sort of, I think, naive ideas sometimes about how emotion works, that you feel happy or you feel sad or you feel mad, and we don't really think about the fact that a lot of times we don't just feel one single emotion in isolation, right? We feel a lot of things and there's different flavors. And so I think it can be the case that overstimulation makes you bored and it can also make you frustrated. We don't have data for this, but I suspect also that in the right circumstances, it makes people anxious. Mm-hmm. And so you may have these sorts of actually kind of really terrible mixed emotion states where you're I'm frustrated and anxious and kind of bored, all at the same time. I feel when I talk to students, bio majors who are having trouble with OChem and stuff like that, that's kind of the mix that they're often reporting, which is I can't deal with it. I'm really anxious about my grade. And also just sitting in class makes me want to rip my hair out because it's so boring. Yeah. They often don't stay bio majors. But, it's this idea that we can feel lots of different things and that we can have these much more complex, I think, emotional experiences than we often think about in lay terms, but also then how we study. We don't really study these multiple dynamics going on at the same time. We tend to, as academics, study, positive affect and negative affect, feeling good, feeling bad. Or if we're doing more fine grained, we're going to look at flavors of bad in isolation. So you're going to study fear and I'm going to study boredom, and that person down the street is going to study anxiety, and we don't really look at how those states all come together. We also have some experimental evidence. This study I talked about was correlational. We have some experimental evidence that shows that if you take a really challenging task and you make it a little bit easier, that people actually report reduced boredom, which is interesting because if boredom is all about understimulation, then making something easier should always make it more boring.
Hmm.
And we find that when you make these really challenging tasks, cognitive tasks, easier, if they were too hard to begin with, you actually make it less boring as you make it easier, which again, I think it's that U-shaped curve. Like it may absolutely be the case that people feel anxious or feel frustrated when things are too hard, depending on, what other components are present.
Hmm.
But they also can feel bored. And I think that's something that like I often like to make the case is that when we say that a lack of meaning leads people to feel boredom or, overstimulation leads people to feel boredom, it doesn't mean it can't also lead them to feel other things. Different emotions can sort of have overlap in the ingredients, but it doesn't mean that they don't feel bored as well. Like it works both ways. It just because you might feel frustrated when something is too hard doesn't mean you don't also feel bored. Just because you feel bored doesn't mean you also don't feel frustrated or anxious.
That makes perfect sense. Yes. You've you've written about and researched about some of the consequences of boredom or some of the things people tend to do when they're bored. And so I know we just acknowledged that you're still looking into the different consequences based on the type of boredom that it is. But for what we do know of what boredom tends to lead to, what types of behaviors do we know might be consequences of boredom?
It's funny you asked that because one of my hobbies, I'm a very exciting person, but one of my hobbies is keeping track of things in the news that people have done supposedly because they were bored. And it's it's all over the map. Like I think my favorite is this guy in Russia stole an armored vehicle, basically a tank. He like stole like a military tank, drove it down the street, crashed it into a few cars, then crashed it into a grocery store. My favorite part is then he got out of it, the tank, went inside and like stole a bottle of wine out of the store. And of course, they finally go and stop him like, what are you doing? And he was like, I was just really bored. And you'll see this like in the news all the time. I have a little news like Google alert for like because I was bored that like will
Mm.
pop up. And some of these are kind of funny, like that one. A couple of the more recent ones, there was a woman in the Washington Post who, she claims because of pandemic boredom, started carving bananas. So like using like pressure. It's like she took like these like bananas that were a little old and she started like using like a fork to create sort of like pressure lines on them to like let them bruise into like shadows to create like banana art. And they're actually really good. I looked there, I was impressed.
I'm gonna look this up.
And I really like these two examples because like one of them, stealing tanks and crashing them into grocery stores and stealing like a single bottle of wine is not what we want people to be doing. But on the other hand, creating banana art is kind of whimsical and cute. And
Mm.
like, if that's the worst thing that pandemic boredom is making people do, like, great. Like,
Yes.
I'm pleased. And it's really interesting because I like to say that a lot of my work to this point has focused on this question of like, what is boredom? What causes boredom? And we sort of move now to like, okay, well, and that way I sort of more of a handle on what boredom is. We want to talk about what boredom does. And so there's this one sort of school of thought that says it's, boredom is bad, that boredom is tied to all these kinds of negative, behaviors, maybe not stealing tanks, but things like, substance use, risky behavior, all these kinds of negative forms. Certainly, if you look in sort of like the workplace and in school, like bored students and bored employees are not doing good things. They're getting into trouble.
Mhm.
Um, on the other side, we also have this sort of perspective. I think you see this a little bit more in the popular media and popular press that like boredom is like the root of creativity and that boredom leads to like daydreaming and creative insight, creative breakthroughs. And so it's really been an interesting question for those of us who study boredom, like to what extent is boredom bad or is boredom good? And there's, if you sat down and tallied up the different research lines, you could put a lot of tallies in both camps. There's a little more tallies, I would say, in like the boredom is bad camp. But what I always try to remind people is like that's partially a bias in what we look for, right? Like if we're looking at boredom and negative outcomes, we're going to find more boredom and negative outcomes. So it's hard to say.
Right.
There are a few studies linking boredom to creativity and pro-social behavior. There just aren't that many of them. They tend to be smaller studies. And so I think more work needs to be done. Um, and I talked about how like when we talked about, boredom and attention, I kind of drew on these sort of really basic premises of how attention works. And we can do kind of the same thing with boredom and behavior, that we can draw on these really basic premises of how emotion influences behavior. And very few emotions are entirely good or entirely bad. So things like anger, for instance, of course, people do terrible things out of anger. But anger is also really important for, signaling a boundary violation. And people do lots of important good things out of anger too. Anger can be positive. And I think boredom is very much the same way. And I think that in some ways accounts for why we see this sort of discrepancy in the literature, where, one study comes out and says boredom causes pro-social behavior. And then another study comes out and goes, boredom causes antisocial behavior. And it's like, wait, how can it do both? And it's like, but of course it can do both. Emotions do different things in different circumstances. And so what I like to say is that boredom isn't good or bad. It's a signal. It's just information. And, whether the outcome is good or bad depends on what we do with that information and how we react to it. And when we have good options available, people may be more likely to do creative things like make banana art when they're bored. And when they don't have those same good options available, they may be more likely to do bad things and get into trouble. So it's not really about boredom. It's more like this light goes off on your dashboard and you have to figure out what to do with it. And you kind of look around your environment and say like, oh, what can I do that feels meaningful and is a good challenge right now? And hopefully you have some good, alternatives available. But if you don't, boredom sort of pushes people to take whatever action they can find. And so I think boredom can push people towards bad behavior in cases where those are sort of the options available to people on the table. In the same way, it can push people towards good behavior when they have good options on the table. So it's really a neutral force. It's sort of a motivating force, but not an evil or a good force per se. It just kind of is.
Makes sense. And what's coming to my mind right now is I often think about the way that anytime we experience an aversive emotion, which I think people would classify boredom as aversive, it's unpleasant, it's not a good feeling. Many people have the impulse to just reach for a substance so that they can just kind of instantly change their state of mind. And I'm not against, I think substances have their role, of course, in human beings' lives. But when we use them to simply cancel out or bury or numb any unpleasant feeling, I think one of the consequences of that is we miss out on these very important signals, which actually might guide us to live a more meaningful life. And I think that's true for many unpleasant emotions that we experience, is that although they're unpleasant, if we kind of allow them to fuel our behavior and not be quick to change them, it can be really productive ultimately on our lives. And you've offered what you describe as the 4 roads to boredom regulation, which I think are very helpful, especially when people have the habit of just drinking something, smoking something, binge watching something, or just kind of finding some ultimately maybe meaningless stimulation to no longer feel bored. So maybe I'll kind of cue you. I mean, I know you have them memorized, but I can cue you and you can speak to each one. But right before we dive into that, do you have any thoughts on, like what guidance you would offer someone who's constantly turning to substances every time they're bored?
Yeah, so we know a lot about emotion regulation. And just exactly like you said, like there's sort of two, very roughly making broad generalizations, but there's roughly 2 ways to deal with negative emotions. You can engage with them and sort of, be like, okay, I feel mad. Why? And do something about the situation that made you angry to begin with. or, or I feel bored, why, and do something to fix the situation that led to you feeling bored to begin with. Or you can try to just sort of shove those feelings away and ignore them. That second group of strategies of just sort of pushing it away and covering up negative emotions, it doesn't work. Like, it feels good in the moment, right? Like, but you can't drink forever. You can't play video games forever. You can't really push these things away. And like, certainly in some cases like anxiety, we know that like avoidance is one of the best ways to make anxiety come back,
Mm.
that it just makes it worse. And part of that is that you're not solving the root problems that those emotions are there to tell you about. That, like, if you feel angry, you may feel angry for a reason. If you feel bored, you may feel bored for a reason. And if you don't fix that situation, you just sort of cover it up and like cover up the symptoms of it without addressing the causes of it. Um, you're going to be bored again. It's not going to go away. I always like use I'm terrible about going to the doctor. So I always use like the example of like, like if like you have like this terrible cough and you keep coughing all the time, and you really should go to the doctor because like maybe you have heart problem, there's probably something wrong and you need to go to the doctor and fix it. But if you're like me, you just take a lot of, cough medicine and it's like, well, I'm not coughing, so now it's fine. But it's not, right? Like, you're covering up the symptom, but you're not actually figuring out what the root problem is and doing anything to fix like the actual reason that you feel bad to begin with. And emotions are the same way, that it can be really rewarding temporarily to use these sort of superficial distractions to feel better, because they do work for the, right
Mm.
then and there.
Mhm.
The problem is that they stop working. And when they stop working, it's like that bad emotion is still there because you haven't done anything to fix the problems that led you to feel that way to begin with. So it's really sort of a band-aid.
Yeah.
It's not causing you, it's not really helping you in an enduring way,
Mm.
and really addressing things like fear and boredom and anger and a lot of these negative emotions. It feels bad and scary to do it, to turn and face it and deal with it. And I think some people need, professional help and, in doing that. But really, that's how we make negative emotions go away for good, is by dealing with the information they're giving us and making changes, either in how we understand the world and understand the circumstances, or changing the circumstances themselves. So and I tell myself this too, because I think it's ironic that as a boredom researcher, I'm just as guilty of anyone else of like, oh, I'm so bored. Where is my Facebook? I'm gonna scroll through Twitter for 2 hours, and like, I know better, and it doesn't work. It's sort of unsatisfying. And as soon as you put the phone down, it's like, bam, well, I'm still bored. And it's like, well, why do you feel bored? Like, what, something in your life is either not feeling meaningful or not appropriately challenging, and you need to find ways to bring those things back in, not just cover up those feelings. So I think that is really the message that I would give to other guilty parties such as myself, which is that, it's really tempting. It feels good in the moment, but I at least find it helpful to know that, like, this is really a stopgap measure, and it's not gonna solve it. If I want to solve it, I need to actually like turn and deal with it, not just try to make it go away.
Yes. Beautiful. And it's, yeah, I just think when we do that, well, I'll just say this too. The social media example, I mean, that's even more relatable, I think, than substance abuse. That is, there are many people who I think pull off almost never feeling bored because they always have a stimulant in the form of social media. But like you said, the problem is that it stops working. Not only do, anything that could become an addiction, not only does it have potentially negative consequences, but our tolerance for it just increases. And so the same amount of it doesn't have the same effect. And then we're always grasping for more, and its effects are waning. And ultimately, we're just left with sometimes, like, I even think of it this way: for people who, let's just say, live in a way that's very conscious and intentional with minimal abuse or addiction issues, if you're a ship and you're on course, the moment it starts to get off course, you notice that, you feel that, and you can correct it before you're far off course. But what I feel like distracting things do is they allow us to get way off course for what a meaningful life is. And then it becomes increasingly daunting to
Yeah.
get back on course. And so that leads to just an increased dependency on the things that make you not have to worry about the fact that you're so off course. So again, I think by just being self-aware and processing these feelings in that way that you described, it keeps us on course toward a life that is ultimately fulfilling. So perhaps this is a segue into those those four roads to boredom regulation. So talk to us about, anyone that comes to mind first. I know you talk about regulating cognitive demands. Maybe we can start there.
Yeah. So I think this is one case where it can be so helpful to know that you can be bored for more than one reason. Because otherwise you're like, I'm bored and I want to fix it and I don't know how. Like, what do I do? And so there's these kind of two ways you can feel bored. Like you can feel bored because you can't pay attention, or you can feel bored because what you're doing doesn't feel meaningful. And the things that fix problems with attention are not the same things that fix problems with meaning. So say you feel bored because you're in a classroom and what you're doing is too easy, or it's too hard. It's like whatever is happening, like the challenge level isn't right for me. And there's sort of two ways to fix that. One is what we call regulating cognitive demands. And that's a very sort of technical term for like literally just make what you're doing easier or make what you're doing more challenging. People do this all the time in classrooms, like my example earlier when I was like swimming on the reef and I was like, this is too easy. It's like people add little games, they make up like time challenges, they find ways to increase the challenge of what they're doing to sort of keep their engagement in it. And that's fantastic. And that's something that is, available to everyone. My mom in high school worked on an assembly line, assembling little wires. And she talks about how, she was working with all these much older women who'd been there, for like decades. And she's like this, like, basically this kid. And she would like create games for herself. Like how many of like the wires of different colors could she put together at once? Or like how long could she wait, but, and still do it in time. And like, everyone else on the assembly line was like, what are you doing? But her dad worked there, so it was fine. But she like had to like find ways to like create challenges for herself. And in psych speak, that's just regulating cognitive demand. It's increasing the cognitive demands to meet our sort of mental resources and energy level at the moment. And that's a great way to sort of make things less boring because it's taking something that was too easy, adding demands to it so that it sort of brings it up to your level so that it's challenging again. And you can do the same thing on the other end where, you take something that's really hard, like say like, oh my goodness, I decided to get into vegetable farming this year and like gardening. And I was like, where do you even begin? And I was like, well, I'm going to break it down into steps. Step one is, I need a garden bed, and it's like, this is called chunking that you can take, or scaffolding, that you can take these like big demanding things and break it down into individual pieces. So the whole thing at once might be too daunting, but broken down into individual parts, you can sort of handle each part one at a time. And all that's really doing is taking this thing that's really demanding and bringing it down to the level that you're at right now so that you can do a little bit at a time. And, this is how all of education works. We start people out with like reading easy books, and as things get harder, we make them more difficult. And, we take hard concepts and break it down for learners. But these are things we can do for ourselves as well if we're aware of it, that this is a strategy. So one group of sort of strategies for boredom, if you realize that like what you're doing is like, oh my God, this is too hard or too easy, is to find ways to make it simpler or more complicated so that it sort of matches your own personal Goldilocks level in that moment.
Beautiful.
The flip side is, that's really changing like what you're doing, but you can also change yourself. This is harder because self-change is hard. But people do this all the time. And the most obvious way is by learning and studying and getting better at things, practice. One thing it does is it actually increases your ability level. And so that same, I played violin in high school, that same piece of music that was too hard for me in sixth grade, was, great in ninth grade. It's not that the piece changed, it's that I became a better player. And so this thing that was too hard was now a good fit, but it's because I had changed and my ability level had gone up. So that's one way that we can modulate sort of our own abilities, often by raising them. So it's maybe not ideal, but people also do this all the time through sort of physiological means, like caffeine, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
or perhaps more healthily, taking a nap or getting a lot of sleep. There's some interesting literature suggesting, and this is not a good way to do it, but that workers, for instance, in understimulating careers are more likely to drink on the job, perhaps because it brings their their cognitive, resources down a bit, so it's a better fit. This is not good. This is very bad. This
Right.
is not an appropriate boredom regulation strategy.
Make
Uh,
myself less coordinated so that just walking is
it's
stimulating.
a challenge. Yeah, yeah. No, it's a creative solution to boredom. Um, Not a recommended solution. But so like there's these ways that like if you're bored because you're having, there's this like mismatch between your ability and what you're doing, you can alter what you're doing, or you can alter yourself in ways to make it a better fit. Golf handicaps are a great example of this as well, where if they're a really good golfer, you make it harder for them. None of that's going to matter if you are able to pay attention just fine and you just don't care and what you're doing is meaningless. So the other strategy that we talk a lot about is regulating goal value. And that sounds very technical. Basically, what it means is thinking about what you're doing and finding meaning in it. It's really meaning making. That my classic go-to example for this is my taxes, because I hate doing my taxes. It just feels like this big bureaucratic exercise. And I don't, I can do it. It's not too hard. It's not too easy. It just is like, oh my gosh, why do I have to? And, I'll kind of pause and be like, no, I'm not like doing a lot of burdensome paperwork. I'm like giving back to society. And I'm like, paying for roads and like education. And like, I'm really just mentally reframing. And what I'm doing in that is taking the activity that I'm already doing and connecting it to goals I care about that have a lot of value. And so I always sort of use the analogy of like tuning the radio. You're sort of dialing in on like, I'm doing this thing, I'm going to keep doing this thing, but how can I connect what I'm doing to things I care about? And there's lots of work that this is useful for people. So Chris Holman at the University of Virginia does work on what's called utility value interventions, where if you take students in classes that they kind of don't care about, like a math class or a science class, and you're like, okay, what do you care about? Can you find ways to connect what you're learning about in your math class to your personal goals and your personal values? And what it's getting them to do, there's now called utility value interventions, is it's getting them to see the utility in what they're learning in the classroom for things they actually care about in their own lives. And when you do that, they're more interested, they're less bored, and they do much better in those courses. And so I think sometimes we think of meaning as just something that is in the world, but we can make meaning, and we can find meaning in things that might not feel meaningful to us necessarily on the surface.
Yes.
And I think that's something that folks don't always understand, this idea that meaning isn't objectively out there in the world. It's something that we co-create with what we're doing. And so, if you feel bored because what you're doing isn't meaningful, one way to fix that is to reestablish that meaning link and figure out like, okay, what do I care about and why does it matter to those things? Which brings me to the fourth strategy, because sometimes you do that and you're like, I just really don't care about this. Like it really is truly meaningless.
You're almost like just trying to rationalize it, but
yeah.
It doesn't.
Like it's almost, it makes it worse. It's like I'm having to go to so many extremes that like, ugh. It's just highlighting how not meaningful this is.
Right.
And so the fourth strategy, and I think descriptively, this may be the most common strategy for dealing with boredom, is to do something else. If you're dialed in, you can't make, it's optimally challenging, or you can't alter it in some way. You're at work and you have a demanding boss and it is what it is. You can't make it meaningful. You can quit your job and go get another job. You can turn the channel. I don't like this movie. I'm going to watch a movie that like is more in accord with my values and that I care about. And so I think this kind of activity switching is really common, especially because it can sort of solve, two problems with one throw. That like if you're having trouble paying attention and what you're doing doesn't feel very meaningful, you can just sort of switch from, doing your taxes to like hugging my dog, which like is meaningful and optimally engaging for me, as opposed to doing my taxes. And so it lets you sort of solve these multiple problems at once. And it also, I think, is sometimes used because it doesn't require a lot of insight into why you feel bored. You can just kind of like try a bunch of different things and find something that fits. And this is like very much like the strategy kids use when they go up to their parents and they go, Mom, Dad, I'm bored. Like, give me something else to do. Like, and we'll just, trial and error, find something that works. And I think that's where you see a lot of these sort of kookier behaviors coming in with boredom, where like, you're sitting around and you're bored and like, why not start poking at this banana? Like it's something to do.
Yeah.
And, in that case, it ended up being very meaningful for her. She's like a whole like banana artist now.
I love it.
And, I think one thing that knowing a little bit more about boredom does is it lets you have a little bit more insight into what kinds of activities you should pick when you're bored. So like instead of this sort of indiscriminate switching to like, oh, I'm bored, here's my phone, oh, I'm bored, there's a banana, you can be like, oh, there's an armored tank, you can be like, I'm bored, like, that means that what I'm doing probably doesn't feel super meaningful. Like, what can I do that's really meaningful right now that I could switch to? Or, I'm really tired. Is there something really easy I could do? Or like, I feel really energized and like up. Like maybe this is a good time to go work on my Duolingo Spanish skills or whatever. And I think it sort of helps, that knowledge of like what the potential problems could be helps people steer people, I think, into better solutions to boredom. And I always meet these people. So like I said, when I go to parties, half the people flee. And they're like, oh my God, you study boredom, please go away. And then the other half promptly tell me that they never feel bored. They're like, I never feel bored. Like, who are these strange people you study? And it's not that they never feel bored, but I think some people are really adept at solving boredom when they first feel those initial flickers. It's like your analogy about like, when they're a little off course, they're able to correct it and tell and make the adjustments. And so I think people that are really good at finding meaningful, challenging activities that are calibrated to their current level, it's not that they never feel bored, but that they can make those adjustments and switch to appropriate non-boring activities for them before it gets really bad, before you dive off in like the 7 C's of boredom and don't even, have the first clue of how to get back.
Nice. The 7 C's of boredom. It's a large C out there.
That sounds terrible.
But yeah, so okay, let me summarize that. So the 4 roads to boredom regulation are reduce cognitive demands, increase cognitive resources, essentially, I forget how you put it exactly, but the meaning related one, reframing and checking in with what the value of this activity is, seeing if you can find value that you are overlooking, and then 4th, switching activities. Is that right? Okay. And then what I like, and so many things I find helpful about this, but one is that it strikes me that it becomes very helpful to be in touch with what is valuable to you, with what is meaningful to you, because I don't know that that's a given that people are all that aware of that or have reflected on that much. And I would imagine that if you're not aware of what is meaningful and valuable and what your ambitions are, you might even be maybe more susceptible to boredom because more and more things seem to be meaningless or unrelated to your goals because you don't really know what they are.
Yeah. No, I agree. Samantha Heinzelman is a researcher who did a lot of work on meaning in life, and we're good colleagues and friends, and we talk about this a lot, that like, that's a question she'll ask sometimes. She's like, do people even know like that what they're doing isn't meaningful? And I was like, well, they kind of do indirectly because they feel bored. Boredom is like sort of a flag to people that like, whatever I'm doing right now isn't meaningful, but it doesn't necessarily tell them what is meaningful or what would be meaningful instead.
Right.
And one of the things that really strikes me, for instance, about Chris Holman's work on these utility interventions is that these students aren't doing it themselves, that researchers have to come in and tell them like, hey, that math class, did you notice that that's actually really related to these goals that you have in your life? That like, part of it, I think, is difficulty in recognizing, what is meaningful to me And then part of it is difficulty in like drawing those links, like sort of like, okay, God and family and this are meaningful to me, but that has nothing to do with my, math class,
Mm.
or, whatever the case is, that people kind of, I think, sometimes need assistance in both ways.
Mm.
We actually have a slightly different line of work. We've been looking at why people sort of don't enjoy being alone with their own thoughts. Like if you tell people to just, have fun thoughts and enjoy yourself, people aren't great at it. And one of the things that is surprising to us is we sort of assumed that when you told people to, think about enjoyable things, surely they would pick like meaningful things, right? Like, oh, like, my birthday, my wedding, or, my plans after graduation for college students. But we ran a study just to double check, and they didn't. Like when you ask people to like, you can think about whatever you want, most people just sort of plan their day. If you steer them a little bit towards, think whatever you want, but like try to have a good time doing it, they pick these really mundane things to think about, like eating ice cream. And like, I don't know about you, but like eating ice cream's great, but I can't think about it for like 5 minutes. Like, right? That's like like intensive ice cream meditation. And it was really surprising to me, and I think to my colleagues, that people weren't spontaneously sort of choosing to think about these presumably meaningful topics that they could have. There's nothing
Mm.
keeping you from, if I say, Nick, think about something really, fun right now, you could choose to think about like, oh, I'm gonna imagine like, being 65 and looking at like my friends and family and this wonderful life I've created. But instead, when we do that, people are like, yeah, I'll think about dessert and,
Mm. That
uh,
is this is a particularly interesting aspect of this whole conversation,
yeah,
actually. Just the engaging with mental activity and imagination and discursive thought. And I mean, I think many people almost feel like it's torturous sometimes to be alone with your thoughts and know kind of nothing else to do. Um, and so yeah, it's like you got me thinking. You got me
yeah,
thinking.
no, it's very odd. It's like, I think it's the great paradox, because we all have these times where we're sort of lost pleasantly in thought, and it's wonderful.
Mhm. Mhm.
But we have this whole line of work where, we thought like, oh, it's so wonderful when this happens. What if we just tell people to do it on command? They'll have like this great time. And they didn't. They very much didn't. They, on a 9-point scale, they say it's about a 5. So it's like about the same as brushing your teeth, which is fine, but not something I do for fun, at least. If you give people, tell them to do fun things like by themselves, they enjoy that a lot more than thinking fun thoughts by themselves. And we have this one study where like we let people like give themselves an electric shock, like while they like tried to like enjoy their own thoughts, and like they didn't have to, they could have just sat there and, quietly like had wonderful thoughts, but 67% of the men and about a fourth of the women chose to shock themselves. And
Interesting.
yeah, I think it's this really interesting question of like, we have, I think, all of this incredible brain and these incredible mental resources and this incredible ability in some ways to introspect about what's meaningful to us, and to seek those sorts of like thoughts, and like, um, think about the things that are meaningful, find connections between what we're doing now and the things we care about. And it surprises me that people don't seem to do it as easily or as intuitively as you might think, that it doesn't seem to sort of spontaneously imagine, sort of occur to people that they could do these things.
Mm.
The students in the utility value interventions, they weren't drawing these inferences on their own, these connections between what they were doing in school and these deeply meaningful things in their own lives. The people in our studies where we tell them to think fun thoughts aren't spontaneous unless we give them some nudges. Um, it's not like occurring to them for some reason to be like, oh, I could think about like meaningful things I really care about. And so there's this interesting bridge that I don't know if it's an inability or a lack of motivation, or just almost a blind spot that we don't always, it doesn't always occur to us to think about what's meaningful and find ways to link what we're doing up with those things that are meaningful to us. So
Mm.
I think that's a really good point you bring up.
Hmm. Well, let me maybe ask you this question. I know we've been talking for about an hour, and I always appreciate and kind of do a shout out at this point to the people who are still listening. I mean, you are the motivation, the people listening to these long form conversations, I just are becoming, rarer and rarer. So I appreciate it so much. But anyway, the maybe one more question. As someone who thinks about thinking, I'm curious about your thoughts about this thought. And the
Come
thought,
on.
the thought is, so it seems to me, firsthand and in observing others, that thinking is relatively volitional, but it's not always volitional. And it's an interesting question, I think. Is thinking something that can be brought under voluntary control? And in my experience, and again, in observing others, I think that yes, it is, that there's some degree to which we can think on purpose, and at the same time, I mean, this is just me kind of philosophizing and speculating, but it seems to me that there's, in a way, your mind is something you can control, and it's also something that interacts back with you in a sense. You can almost, for example, you can say, where did I leave my keys? And kind of keep your mind on that question. And your mind may produce the memory spontaneously of where you had set your keys. So I think of it as this interaction, in a sense, with your own mind. And so what I'm kind of just trying to say is that I think thinking is volitional to some degree, and it's just also spontaneous and out of nowhere to some degree. And I don't know that the degree to which thinking is volitional is the same for everybody. I think that some people experience mental activity in a way that feels involuntary. I mean, you can think of an extreme example of someone who is experiencing hallucinations and schizophrenic symptoms or psychotic symptoms where their mind feels completely out of their control. But then, of course, more relatably, there are people with varying degrees of control over their own thinking. So I'm just curious to know your thoughts on that, and whether we can kind of improve at our ability to volitionally bring about interesting, entertaining, and meaningful thoughts.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. There's this whole debate, even in the mind wandering literature, about whether mind wandering is by definition spontaneous or whether people ever intentionally try to mind wander. And what you really find is like the full spectrum that, like, yeah, sometimes it's spontaneous and, you're reading a book and the next thing you know, you're like, planning a trip to somewhere else or, thinking about that phone call you didn't make. And sometimes, you're in a boring class and you're kind of like, I'm going to zone out and think about something else. There's this whole sort of broad continuum. And then there's also this sort of whole debate about like, well, what counts as mind wandering versus sort of intentional thinking? Like, does it have to be a sort of free floating kind of like associative thought? Can it like have this like very clear, like problem solving seems like not mind wandering, but like, where are these actual distinctions? And I think there's been a lot of really interesting work by Paul Saley and others who have sort of argued that um, that human thinking covers all of that. That we try to sort of carve nature at its joints and like separate out like intentional from spontaneous thinking, from like problem solving versus free associative thought. But that really all of this is this big spectrum, this sort of big sea, and we're sort of partialing it out to look at different pieces of it.
Mm.
Which is to say that we've looked at that as well. We did a thought sampling study, which we just basically, it's exactly what it sounds like. We pinged people throughout the day and said like, hey, what are you thinking about right now? And then we asked them questions like, how intentional was it versus spontaneous? How much were you focused on like inward on your own thoughts versus like outward on like what you were doing, like watching a movie and being enthralled, and it would be like completely outward. Being completely lost in the daydream would be completely inward. And we just found a huge amount of variety. One thing that we did find that I find really fascinating and that I think is useful for this conversation, but not necessarily helpful for people trying to take something away from it. But it was that spontaneous thoughts were more extreme, that like people did have intentional positive thoughts and people did have intentional negative thoughts. But when those same kinds of thoughts happen spontaneously instead of intentionally, they were much stronger.
Hmm.
So sort of if you take, like if you're having a spontaneous positive thought and I'm having a sort of an intentional positive thought, you're probably feeling more positive and your thought is sort of about a more positive thing than my thing, and vice versa. That there's something about these spontaneous thoughts, which are really interesting because it's like you said, sort of the brain talking to itself. Like, how can you spontaneously think about something? Like, how can you surprise yourself with your own thoughts? But you can, and when you do, they tend to result in sort of more emotional intensity than when you sort of deliberately try to bring something to mind. And I think we've all had that experience that, walking along being like, oh, I'm going to think about that time my grandma said that really nice thing. Like, it was good. But like when like you're in the store and you're suddenly like struck by that memory,
Mm.
seemingly out of nowhere, that's a much more powerful experience. And at this point, we don't really know why. There seems to be this, what we've called this spontaneity intensification effect, where spontaneous thoughts are not better or worse, but just more intense.
Mm.
And other people have found work. I think there are other studies that have also sort of found a similar thing, that spontaneous thoughts seem to be more extreme, and we don't really know why that is at this point. There's some evidence that part of what makes it hard to think for pleasure, to enjoy your own thoughts, is that it just literally is hard. It's really cognitively demanding. I sometimes say you have to be like the actor and the screenwriter and the director and the audience of this whole sort of mental performance, and that maybe that is just less enjoyable than just getting to feel like you're the audience, that it's
Mm.
sort of done for you, right?
Great analogy.
And one thing we do see, it's very, very small, but there is some small correlation between folks who have like prior meditation experience and being a little bit better at enjoying their own thoughts when we ask them to in the lab. We
Mm.
also find, again, it's small, but older folks tend to be a little bit better at this than younger folks,
Mm.
which may be a practice effect of some sort. They tend to find it more, they tend to be more motivated to do it, but they also tend to have an easier time concentrating on their thoughts when it happens,
Mm.
both of which tend to make it more enjoyable. And so I do think that we can probably become better at this, partly through just, better sort of ability to sort of regulate our own sort of mental states. Like I feel like anyone who's ever tried meditation like recognizes that it's really hard at first, but like most people, if they stick with it, do get better at it relatively over time.
Mm.
And then the other piece of that is that part of it is sort of brute force, like just practice and getting better and getting better at, this mental control. But I think part of it is just knowledge. One of the things we found is that we can make this experience more pleasant just by being like, hey, when I tell you to think about pleasant thoughts, you should focus on meaningful ones. So, and that's not really a practice thing. It's sort of like oh, I didn't know that's what I should be doing.
Mm.
Or like when we say you can think about whatever you want, most people don't choose to try to use that time to enjoy their own thoughts. So some of this is sort of not about like ability. It's more like it just doesn't occur. They don't know how to do it. It doesn't occur to people spontaneously that they could use these kinds of downtimes for thinking pleasant thoughts, thinking meaningful thoughts. And the other thing we found is that we can make it a little easier for folks. It is really cognitively demanding. And kind of like when we were talking about with boredom, where you can regulate the cognitive demands or you can regulate the cognitive resources, you can practice and get better at it. Or we can make it easier by having you list some topics you'd like to think about in advance so that, when it comes time, it's like, oh, that's right. I really do love thinking about, the first dog my family had, or, whatever it is. So it sort of takes a little bit of the legwork out of it so you can focus more on like the actual thinking and the enjoyment of it and less on sort of setting up the experience for yourself. And
Mm.
that seems to make it more enjoyable as well.
Mm. Fascinating. And I've watched a couple podcasts back, and my self-critique is that I say fascinating a little too much, but this is just really fascinating. It's a very careful use of the word.
All right, it's well considered.
Well considered. So, yeah, so much about that is intriguing to me. One of which is, I mean, of course, the increased intensity of spontaneous thoughts. That I hadn't really heard it explained in that way, but it makes perfect sense, even just thinking about my own firsthand experience. and it highlights to me that improving at your ability to kind of control your mind is extremely helpful when those spontaneous thoughts are intensifying very unpleasant,
Yeah.
anxious, depressive feelings. You'd like to kind of neutralize that. But on the other hand, you wouldn't ever really want complete control over your mind. It's in the same way you wouldn't want complete control and domestication of like a beautiful horse. You want it to run in the field majestically. And in this, I think of our minds in a similar way, that we always want our minds to produce spontaneous thoughts. I think many insights dawn spontaneously. I mean, revelations just kind of dawn on us sometimes. Beautiful memories, like you said, just strike us out of nowhere. So it's like, it's just interesting to think about this, and how we want those spontaneous thoughts that intensify wonderful feelings. And then where necessary, we want the ability to control and kind of bring back even just mundane thoughts or positive thoughts when spontaneous thoughts are intensifying anxious and depressive feelings. Those are my reflections here as I'm processing this.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting because I think when we think about spontaneous thoughts, we tend to think about like intrusive negative thoughts that
Hmm.
you want to go away and you want to control. And that doesn't work well, right? Like, I mean, we know it from the research, but also I'm sure you and anyone listening has like knows that you can't just like wish these intrusive negative thoughts away, that it's much, if anything, it makes them rebound and come back. And so I think it's really interesting to think about how the solution isn't necessarily complete mental control. It's more changing the ratio. Like spontaneous, intrusive thoughts are fine as long as they're more positive, and we just don't want them to be negative and disruptive and harmful. And
Yes.
so, yeah, I really like that thought.
Mm. Well, I can honestly say that this conversation about boredom has been one of the most intriguing conversations I've had. I really enjoyed this. And thank you so much for sharing your expertise and enlightening us all about this fascinating topic.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I love the chance to proselytize about why boredom is not boring. It really is a little window. It's this mundane little boring little window, and then you open it up and it's like, oh, like you're actually getting at like the big questions, like what is meaning? Like I don't know that there's much bigger than that. And I
Right.
love it really pushes us right to the boundary of where psychology is, I think.
Amen. Well, I will continue to follow the research that you publish, and I hope we can stay connected.
Yeah, for sure.
And I just want to say again to the audience, I trust you've enjoyed this like I did, and I thank you for listening and staying tuned into the Psychology Is podcast. Have a wonderful day to you listening, and have a wonderful day to you, Dr. Westgate.
Thank you so much. You too.
If you like this video and you want to see more, please subscribe.